The caged girl. The marketplace on the edge of the alien colony was loud with voices of traders, merchants, and cruel spectators who gathered not only to buy and sell, but also to laugh at the misery of others. Among the cages of strange animals and rare creatures there was one that stood out, not because of its size or strength, but because inside the iron bars sat a girl who looked almost human, yet not fully. Her skin shimmered faintly under the pale suns, marked with delicate patterns that seemed more like noble carvings than scars. Her long silver hair hung tangled and dirty, her clothes were rags, and her bright eyes that once must have been full of pride were dulled with exhaustion. She did not cry out. She did not beg. She sat silently like a creature who had accepted her fate. To the traders she was not a girl but a beast, sold as nothing more than entertainment for those who wanted to mock or humiliate her. The crowd jeered and threw scraps of food near her cage, not to feed, but to insult. Children pointed and called her an animal. The slaver standing proudly beside the cage struck the bars with a rod and announced to anyone who listened that this was a rare catch, a creature from a forgotten world, not worth anything as a citizen but amusing as a pet. He laughed when people asked if she understood his words and told them she was too wild to know language. Yet her eyes told another story, for they carried shame, grief, and a silent dignity that none could erase. Those who looked closely might see intelligence burning quietly beneath her silence, but no one cared to see it. To them she was beneath notice, a thing, not a person. Among the crowd walked a human traveler, a man who had come to this colony for supplies after weeks in the void. He wore a worn jacket of a soldier long retired, his eyes sharp from years of surviving on hostile worlds. He moved with calm steps, looking at the stalls without interest until his gaze fell upon the cage. At first he thought she was just another slave, another broken victim among thousands across the galaxy, but then he noticed the way she sat, her back straight despite the chains, her eyes unblinking as if guarding something precious inside herself. She did not bow her head, she did not growl, she did not act like an animal. She endured. He stopped and studied her while the slaver shouted prices. People joked and tossed coins, but the human did not laugh. He saw the bruises on her arms, the cracked skin of her wrists where the shackles bit deep, and yet her posture was one of someone who once knew what it meant to stand tall. She turned her gaze to him, and for a heartbeat her dull eyes sparked with a question, almost disbelief, as though she had never seen anyone look at her without contempt. That fleeting moment was enough. The human felt something stir in his chest, a mixture of anger and resolve. He had seen cruelty across many worlds. But here before him was not a beast, not an animal, but a soul crushed under chains. The slaver noticed the human's stare and grinned, thinking another fool had taken interest. He shouted louder that this creature could be broken easily, that she could serve as entertainment in the pits or as a trophy chained in a hall. The crowd cheered at the words, but the human's expression grew colder. He walked closer, ignoring the laughter, and stood before the cage. The girl did not move away. She met his eyes with a quiet strength as if daring him to see her for what she truly was, and in that instant he did. He did not see an animal. He saw a girl who carried the weight of something greater, something unspoken. He saw not a beast, but someone who should have been honored. Without a word, the human reached into his pouch and tossed credits onto the slaver's table. The merchant's grin widened, thinking he had made an easy profit from a gullible outsider. The cage was opened with a rusty screech, chains dragged across the ground, and the girl was pushed roughly toward him. She stumbled but did not fall. The human stepped forward and steadied her. The crowd booed, disappointed that the show was over, but the human ignored them all. He draped his own jacket around her thin shoulders and guided her away. For the first time in years, the girl felt warmth not of the sun but of kindness. She looked up at him, confusion and disbelief written across her tired face. As they left the market, whispers followed them. People muttered that the human had wasted his money, that he had bought an animal unfit for anything. But the human did not hear them. In his mind, the truth was clear. He had not bought a beast. He had saved someone who deserved far more than chains and mockery. He did not yet know her story, but he knew one thing with certainty. She was no animal. She was something else entirely. The human's choice. The road from the market stretched into the dusty outskirts of the colony, and the human walked with steady steps while the girl moved beside him in silence. She kept her head low, unsure of what was happening or why this stranger had chosen to take her away. Every part of her body ached from years of neglect. her wrists still raw from the shackles. Yet the jacket around her shoulders felt strangely heavy because it carried something she had forgotten long ago. A sense of care. People passing by still glanced and muttered, some sneering at the sight of a human walking with what they still called an animal. But the man ignored them as if their words did not matter. He did not hurry, nor did he push her forward like the slavers once had. Instead, he matched her pace, giving her the freedom to walk on her own feet for the first time in years. When they reached a quiet corner far from the noise of the marketplace, he stopped by a small shelter made of steel and stone where his ship supplies were kept. He opened the door and guided her inside, offering her a seat while he poured water into a metal cup. The girl hesitated at first, expecting a trick, but the dryness of her throat betrayed her doubt and she drank quickly. The water spilled down her chin, yet he said nothing, only refilled the cup until she slowed and her breathing calmed. Then he placed a small pack of food before her, dried rations that he himself had lived on during his travels. She looked at the food with suspicion, for in her past the slavers had sometimes tossed scraps to humiliate her, yet when she took a bite, she realized this was not given in cruelty. It was shared as if she mattered. The man sat opposite her, his face calm, his eyes watching not with ownership but with concern. Finally he spoke, his voice low and steady, telling her that she was safe now, that no one would strike her or cage her again as long as he stood beside her. She did not answer, for her voice had been silenced too long, but her eyes lifted toward him with a flicker of something almost forgotten, a fragile spark of trust. He asked for her name, but she shook her head slowly. Whether she had forgotten or whether she feared speaking it aloud, he could not know, but he did not press further. He simply told her his own name, marking the beginning of something different than chains and orders. For the first time she felt seen. As the hours passed, she began to study him with cautious curiosity. His hands were rough with old scars, his jacket worn from battles he no longer boasted about, and his gaze carried the weight of someone who had seen much suffering. Yet unlike the others, he did not look at her with pity or disgust. He looked as though he recognized something familiar within her, something worth saving. When she shivered, he adjusted the jacket around her shoulders. When she flinched at noises outside, he reassured her with silence and presence rather than harsh commands. Slowly, she began to realize this human did not treat her as property. He treated her as if she had value that night as darkness settled over the colony. She lay on a simple cot he had given her while he rested nearby, keeping his weapon close in case trouble followed. She closed her eyes, yet sleep did not come easily, for memories of her capture haunted her. She remembered the day soldiers stormed her home, remembered fire across the skies and the screams of her people as they were dragged into chains. She had once lived in a palace of stone and crystal, not as a beast but as someone cherished, the daughter of a ruler whose voice commanded respect. All of it had crumbled in flames, and she had been reduced to this, mocked and displayed like an animal in a cage. As the memories burned, she opened her eyes and looked across the room at the human. He was awake still, sitting with his back against the wall, watching the stars through the open hatch. She wondered why he had chosen her, why he had not turned away like the others. In her chest, a question grew heavy. Could he truly see who she was? The next morning, he rose early and began to prepare his supplies for travel. He told her that he planned to leave the colony soon, for he had no ties here and too many eyes were already watching. He gave her the choice to stay behind or follow him. The words stunned her, for never before had she been given a choice. All her life since capture had been chains, commands, and pain. Now someone asked her what she wanted. Her lips trembled, but no sound came. In the end, she simply stood and moved to his side, her decision clear without words. A faint smile crossed his face, one of quiet respect rather than triumph. Together they walked toward his ship, a small but sturdy craft waiting on the edge of the landing field. For the first time in years, she stepped into a place not meant to imprison her, but to carry her toward something unknown. As the engines roared and the colony shrank beneath them, she pressed her hand against the window and felt a strange mix of fear and hope. She had left the cage behind, yet the chains in her heart still clung. She did not know if she could trust this human completely, but already he had done what no other had. He had seen her not as an animal, but as something more. And deep inside, though she dared not believe it yet, a whisper rose that perhaps he saw the truth she had been forced to bury. Perhaps he saw the princess within the princess within. The journey through space was long and silent at first. The girl sat near the viewing window of the small ship, while the human worked on the controls, guiding them through the lanes of traffic that stretched between stars. She watched the endless sea of lights with wide eyes, for even though she had once traveled as royalty, it had been many years since she had seen the stars without the bars of a cage in front of her. The hum of the engines soothed her, and the soft weight of the jacket still wrapped around her shoulders reminded her that she was free of the market. Yet her mind refused to believe it fully. Freedom was a fragile word. Chains had a way of finding her again. The human did not force her to speak, but day by day he encouraged her with small kindnesses. He showed her how to open the ration packs without shame, how to wash the dirt from her skin in the ship's facilities, and how to rest without fear of being struck. At first she only watched him in silence, but as trust grew she began to whisper words, her voice broken but clear. He listened with patience, never rushing her, and little by little she told him more. She confessed that she did understand the language of the traders, and that every insult they had thrown at her had pierced her like a blade. She admitted she had hidden her voice because speaking it would have made their cruelty worse. The human nodded and told her that silence had been her armor, but now she did not need it with him. One evening, as the ship drifted in the quiet between stars, she finally spoke of her past. Her voice trembled, yet she forced herself to continue, for the weight of her truth could no longer stay buried. She told him that she was not born in chains. She was the daughter of a queen, the last heir of a fallen kingdom. Her people had lived on a world rich with forests and oceans, their palaces carved into cliffs that touched the sky. She had been raised to lead, taught the songs of her ancestors and the laws of her people, prepared to rule with wisdom when her time came. But invaders had come from the void with fire and steel. They had crushed her world, slain her guards, and dragged her away while the palace burned. From princess she had become prisoner, and from prisoner she had become nothing more than an animal in the eyes of her captors. The human listened without interruption, his eyes fixed on hers, his hands steady. When she faltered, he urged her gently to continue. She spoke of the years in chains, of the markets where she had been displayed, of the laughter that had broken her spirit piece by piece. Yet even in her darkest words there was a tone of defiance, as if some small ember had never been extinguished. He recognized it at once. He told her that she was not broken, that her dignity had survived even when all else had been stolen. His words struck her like light breaking through shadow. For the first time, someone had not only listened but had believed her. As the days passed, she grew stronger. With food and care, her body began to heal, and with trust, her voice became clearer. She asked the human about his life, and he spoke of the wars he had fought, of the comrades he had lost, and of the worlds he had seen crumble under tyranny. He confessed that he had left battle behind because he no longer believed in the wars of empires. Yet he still carried the instinct to protect those who could not defend themselves. That instinct had led him to her cage. When she asked him why he had chosen her, why he had risked coin and trouble for a stranger, he answered simply that when he looked at her, he did not see an animal. He saw someone who refused to bow, someone who had the bearing of a leader even in chains. He saw a princess. His words left her breathless. She turned away to hide the tears burning her eyes, for she had long believed her title was ashes. Yet here was a human who had looked past the dirt, past the rags, past the humiliation, and recognized the truth she had buried. It was both painful and healing, as though he had reached inside her and pulled forth a part of herself she had forgotten. In that moment she swore silently that she would no longer deny who she was. The chains might have scarred her wrists, but they had not erased her blood. She was not an animal. She was the daughter of a queen. As they approached the next star system, she looked out once more at the endless void. For years it had seemed like a prison of cold darkness, but now it appeared like a sea of possibilities. She did not know what waited ahead, nor did she know if her people still survived, but she knew this human had given her back more than freedom. He had given her back her name, her pride, and her truth. She turned to him and whispered, not with fear but with conviction, that she was a princess of her people and that one day she would reclaim her place. The human's eyes softened and he nodded. He believed her. And with that belief, the first step of her return had already begun. The chains break. The human's ship landed on a small outpost world where travelers came and went without questions. He needed supplies and fuel, but he also knew danger lingered close. Word of the girl's escape would spread quickly among the slavers, and greed would drive them to hunt her down. As the ship settled on the landing pad, the girl stood beside him with a calm resolve. She no longer walked like a beaten slave. Each step she took showed the slow return of her pride. She wore fresh clothes the human had given her, still plain but no longer rags, and her silver hair had been washed, glimmering faintly like starlight. For the first time in years, she felt the air on her skin without the weight of chains. Inside the outpost's market, the two of them moved quietly, gathering food and tools. But eyes followed them. Whispers spread fast. A human was seen walking with a girl who had been displayed as a beast only days before. The slavers who ruled the trade lanes would not let such a loss pass. Soon rough men appeared at the far end of the street, their weapons visible, their faces marked with cruel smiles. They blocked the path, calling out that the girl belonged to them and that the human had no right to take her. The crowd around them backed away, eager to watch the confrontation. Fear clutched the girl's chest, but when she looked at the human beside her, she saw no fear. His expression was calm, his eyes sharp, his hand steady on the weapon at his side. The leader of the slavers laughed and demanded her return, claiming she was nothing more than property. He shouted that the human had bought her with false coin and that the deal was void. His men echoed his threats, their voices rising, but the human did not move. Instead, he spoke with a voice that cut through the noise, firm and clear. He said she was not theirs, that she never had been. He said she was free and that anyone who tried to chain her again would answer to him. The words carried a weight that silenced the crowd. The slavers sneered and raised their weapons, thinking a single man could not stand against many. But they were wrong. The fight erupted in a flash. The human moved with the precision of a soldier who had lived through countless battles. His blaster fired with deadly accuracy, each shot striking true. He advanced without hesitation, using cover with skill, forcing the slavers back. The girl stood frozen at first, fear battling with awe as she watched him fight not for himself but for her. Then something stirred deep inside her. The blood of her ancestors, the training of her youth, the fire of her fallen people rose once more. She seized a metal staff from a nearby stall and swung it with fierce strength when one slaver charged close. The crack of metal against bone rang out and the slaver fell. The crowd gasped. The beast they had mocked was fighting like a warrior. The battle was short but brutal. When the smoke cleared, the slavers lay defeated on the ground, groaning or silent. The human stood tall, breathing hard, his weapon still ready. The girl stood beside him, the staff clenched in her hands, her chest heaving with the rush of reclaimed strength. Together they faced the stunned crowd. The whispers had changed. No longer did the onlookers speak of a beast. They murmured of a fighter, a leader, someone who carried herself with a presence that could not be denied. The human looked at her, his voice calm but firm, and told her once again that she was no animal. She was a princess, and nothing could erase that truth. The slavers fled, beaten and humiliated, but the danger was not gone. The girl knew their masters would send more. Yet as she stood in the dust of the street, the taste of freedom fresh in her mouth, she felt a power she had not felt in years. She had fought. She had stood beside someone who saw her worth. She was no longer hiding in silence. The chains had been broken, not only on her wrists but in her spirit. The human placed a hand on her shoulder, steady and strong, and she felt the weight of his promise. As long as he breathed, no one would reduce her again. When they returned to the ship that night, the girl looked at the stars with new eyes. They no longer seemed distant and cold. They were paths waiting to be claimed. She sat with the staff beside her, a reminder that she was more than what the slavers believed. The human spoke little, but she understood him without words. Together they had faced those who sought to chain her, and together they had won. The journey ahead would be filled with greater dangers, but the first step had been taken. The beast of the market was gone. In her place stood a daughter of a queen, standing taller with every breath, and for the first time since her capture, she allowed herself to believe in a future where her name would matter again. The rising storm. The stars stretched endlessly ahead as the small ship left the outpost behind, carrying with it the echoes of the battle and the whispers of what had happened. News traveled fast in the outer systems, faster than ships themselves, carried by traders eager for gossip and spies eager for reward. Already the tale of the human who had fought slavers to protect a supposed beast spread from port to port, twisting as it went. Some laughed at the foolishness of a human risking his life for an animal. Others whispered with unease that perhaps she was not what the slavers had claimed. Either way, the story could not be stopped, and soon the ears of men more powerful than common traders would hear it, On board the ship, the girl found herself changing with every day that passed. She no longer sat in silence by the window. She trained with the staff she had taken from the outpost, her movements clumsy at first, but growing sharper as her memories of her old lessons returned. The human encouraged her without forcing, offering advice when she stumbled, watching with quiet pride when she improved. Her body was gaining strength. Her voice was becoming clearer, and her eyes no longer carried only grief. They carried fire. The girl who had once been mocked in a cage was returning piece by piece to the princess she had been. One evening, as they drifted between systems, she asked him if he regretted what he had done, if he feared the hunters that would surely come. He answered with a calm voice that he had fought greater enemies than slavers, and that fear was not what guided him. What guided him was choice, the choice to stand when others bowed, the choice to protect when others looked away. She listened and felt a warmth spread in her chest, for no one in her life since the fall of her kingdom had spoken with such certainty. She realized then that he was not only protecting her, he was teaching her again how to believe in herself. But the galaxy is never silent for long. Soon the hunters arrived. It began with a shadow trailing their ship, a vessel painted black with the marks of a syndicate known for its cruelty. The human noticed it first, his instincts sharp from years of war. He changed course, weaving through asteroid fields and narrow trade lanes, but the hunters did not fall away. They wanted the girl back, and they would not stop. The girl sat by his side in the cockpit, her hands trembling as alarms flashed, but he placed his hand over hers and told her to breathe. Together they would survive. The chase stretched over hours, ships exchanging fire across the void. The human piloted with skill, turning their small craft into a dart among giants, dodging blasts that shook the hull. Yet even as fear clawed at her, the girl found herself rising from her seat and manning one of the secondary guns. She had never fought in space before, but her blood carried the courage of her people, and when she fired, the blast struck true. The hunter vessel reeled back, its shields flaring. The human laughed, a sound filled not with mockery but with fierce pride. And together they fought side by side until at last the hunter ship broke away into the darkness. Though they had survived, the human knew this was only the beginning. The syndicates would send more, and soon the news would reach the Galactic Council itself. He told her that once the council learned who she truly was, they would not sit idle. Some would fear her return, some would try to use her as a pawn, and some would want her dead. She listened with steady eyes, no longer the broken slave of the market, but a princess reclaiming her place. She told him that if they came, she would not hide. She would face them. He believed her that night as the ship floated in quiet space. She sat with the staff across her knees and thought of her homeworld. She remembered the halls of her mother's palace, the songs of her people, the banners that had once flown proudly. She whispered to herself that one day those halls would rise again, that her people would no longer be slaves scattered across the stars. The human heard her vow and placed his hand gently on her shoulder. He told her she was not alone in that promise. They would fight together. Far away in the core systems, the whispers finally reached the council chambers. Reports told of a human guarding a strange girl who might not be a beast at all, but the last daughter of a fallen crown. The council members argued, some scoffing at the idea, others pale with unease. They remembered the kingdom that had resisted them long ago, a proud people with strength that had nearly shaken their rule. If the girl truly lived, and if she rose again, the balance of power could shift. And so the storm began to gather, unseen but certain, as fleets and spies turned their gaze toward the human's small ship. The girl did not yet know the weight of what was coming, but she felt it in the silence of the stars. Change was stirring. Her chains had been broken, but now the galaxy itself trembled with the knowledge that she was no animal. She was a princess, and the storm rising ahead would test whether she could reclaim that title or fall again into the shadows of history. The revelation. The council chamber was vast, filled with towering figures from many species, each draped in robes of authority, their voices echoing across the hall as they argued over the reports. Some claimed the girl was nothing but a tale born of rumor. Others insisted the evidence was undeniable. The last princess of the fallen kingdom had survived, and worse, she was traveling under the protection of a human. To some this meant nothing, but to those who understood the weight of history, it was a shadow rising that could not be ignored. Orders were sent across the stars. Fleets were to move quietly. Agents were dispatched to learn the truth. The balance of power was trembling. On the human's ship, the girl felt the tension even before news reached them. She could sense the eyes of the galaxy turning, waiting, watching. She spent her days training harder, sparring with the staff, learning from the human how to fight with weapons she had never known before. He taught her how to hold a blade, how to aim a blaster, how to move with precision. Yet more than skill, he taught her patience and control, for he knew that strength without wisdom was a path to ruin. She listened closely, her determination growing with every lesson. The girl who had once been mocked in chains was becoming again what she had been born to be, a leader and a warrior. The moment of truth came on a neutral world where traitors and officials gathered under fragile peace. The human had chosen the place carefully, believing it safe enough to buy fuel and gather news. But the moment they stepped into the grand hall, whispers rose like a storm. Faces turned, eyes widened, and voices called out in disbelief. The girl walked beside him with her silver hair shining and her posture tall, no longer hunched by chains but straight with pride. She wore simple clothes yet carried herself with the grace of royalty. Someone shouted her name, the true name she had hidden, and the hall erupted. The officials demanded answers. Was she truly who they thought she was? The daughter of the fallen queen? The last heir of a bloodline that once defied the council itself? The human stood beside her, silent but steady, his presence a shield against the storm of voices. The girl took a breath, her heart pounding, and for the first time in years she spoke her name aloud, not as a whisper of memory but as a declaration. She told them she was indeed the princess of her people, stolen in the night when fire consumed her world. She told them she had endured cages and chains, but she had never surrendered who she was. Her voice carried through the hall and silence followed. The crowd did not know how to react. Some fell to their knees in respect, others cried out in fear, and others still shouted that she was a fraud. Yet none could deny the way she stood, the fire in her eyes, the undeniable presence of someone born to rule. The human's voice cut through the noise then, calm and firm. He declared that she was no beast, no slave, no forgotten relic. She was a princess, and he had seen the truth in her when no one else dared to look. He warned that anyone who sought to chain her again would find themselves facing him first. His words were simple, but the authority in them made even the proudest officials pause. The declaration spread across the stars. Within days, fleets were on the move, banners of old loyalists rising once more while enemies sharpened their knives in secret. The galaxy had not expected a human and a broken girl to ignite such fire. But now the truth was out. She could no longer hide, and she no longer wished to. The girl felt fear in her chest, yet it was a fear laced with strength, for she knew she would never face it alone. The human had stood beside her in the cage, in the market, in the outpost, and now he stood beside her before the council. Together they had made the galaxy see her not as an animal, but as what she truly was that night. As they prepared to leave the neutral world, the girl stood on the balcony of their small quarters, looking at the stars. The human joined her silent, his presence as steady as ever. She turned to him and whispered that she was ready for what came next, whether it was battle, exile, or war. He looked into her eyes and nodded, telling her that readiness was not measured by the absence of fear but by the choice to stand despite it. She understood then why he had seen her as more than a prisoner. He had always looked at the strength inside her, the strength she had forgotten, and now that strength would be tested. On a scale greater than either of them had imagined far across the galaxy, war drums began to beat. The revelation of her survival was no longer a whisper. It was a storm gathering force, and soon every corner of the stars would feel its weight. The girl gripped the railing, her heart steady. She had spoken her name, she had claimed her place, and now there was no turning back. She was not the beast of the market. She was the princess of her people, and the galaxy would soon learn the truth. The princess crowned. The galaxy had shifted like a great tide. Fleets that had once ignored the whispers now moved with purpose. Banners of rebellion rising as exiles and loyalists declared their allegiance to the princess who had returned from the shadows. Enemies gathered their own armadas, determined to crush her before her claim grew too strong. The council argued endlessly, some fearing her, others hoping to use her, but all knowing that she could no longer be dismissed as a rumor. The storm had broken, and at its center stood the girl who had once been mocked in a cage, now walking with the pride of her birthright. Her ship flew with urgency toward the hidden system where the remnants of her people had gathered. When she arrived, the sight before her stole her breath. Ships patched together from scraps, camps built in the ruins of once great colonies, faces hardened by years of exile, all turned to watch as she stepped down the ramp. Murmurs ran through the crowd. disbelief and hope mixing in equal measure. She walked forward with the human at her side, her silver hair gleaming in the starlight, her voice steady as she called out her name and lineage. Silence fell as the exiles looked at her, and then, one by one, voices rose in cries of recognition. They had not forgotten their princess. She was alive, and she had come back to lead them. The days that followed were filled with preparation. She listened to her people's stories, their pain, their hunger, their losses. She stood among them not as a distant ruler, but as one who had suffered chains as they had. This bond gave her words power. When she promised that they would rise again, they believed her. The human worked beside her, training the fighters, organizing the defenses, repairing the ships. Together they forged a new strength out of broken fragments. Hope spread through the camp like fire, and with it came determination. The girl who had been enslaved was no longer a victim. She was becoming the leader her people had prayed for, but their enemies did not wait. A vast fleet descended on the hidden system, determined to end the rebellion before it could grow. The sky filled with the thunder of warships, their weapons aimed at the fragile camp. Fear gripped the exiles, but the princess stood tall, her staff raised high, her voice clear across the comms. She told them they were no longer slaves, no longer beasts mocked and beaten. They were children of a proud kingdom, and today they would show the galaxy their strength. The human's voice joined hers, calm and fierce, promising that they would not fight alone. And so the battle began. The clash was fierce and unrelenting. Enemy warships rained fire, but the exiles answered with courage. Small fighters darted between giants, striking with precision. On the ground, defenses lit up the sky, and the princess herself stood at the command center, guiding her people with steady orders. The human fought at her side, his skill turning the tide in places where defeat seemed certain. When the enemy broke through the defenses, the princess joined the fight directly, staff in hand, leading her warriors. Every strike she made echoed with years of pain and defiance, and her people followed her with cries of loyalty. She was no longer hidden. She was the heart of their resistance. The battle stretched for hours, but at last the tide turned. The enemy, stunned by the ferocity of those they had thought broken, began to falter. One by one their ships retreated, unwilling to waste themselves against a force that refused to bow. When the last enemy vessel fled into the void, silence fell across the system. Then, as if a dam had burst, cheers rose from every throat. The exiles had won. Against overwhelming odds, they had stood and triumphed. And at their center was the princess who had returned from chains to lead them. In the days that followed, the exiles crowned her in a ceremony both simple and profound. No golden halls, no jeweled throne, only the gathered voices of her people and the crown of her ancestors placed gently on her head. She looked out at them, her heart heavy with both grief and joy, and swore that she would lead them not into chains but into freedom. The human stood beside her, his presence quiet but unshakable, the protector who had seen her truth when no one else had. As the voices of her people lifted in song, she turned to him with gratitude shining in her eyes. Without him, she would still be a beast in a cage, but because of him, she was a princess crowned. The galaxy would not forget this day. The council would scheme, enemies would rise again, battles would come, but the truth could no longer be erased. She was not an animal. She was not broken. She was a princess, and the stars themselves bore witness to her return. And as long as the humans stood at her side, she knew she would never fall back into silence or chains. Together they had begun a legend, one that would echo across the stars for generations to come. The princess crowned, the galaxy moved like a storm unleashed, and every faction felt its weight as the name of the lost princess spread from world to world, and the proof of her survival stirred both hope and fear. Armadas that had slept for years under the shadow of exile rose again, and enemies that once dismissed her as a rumor sharpened their blades, for the truth could no longer be denied. She was alive, and she was not a beast and not a forgotten prisoner. She was the daughter of a queen, and she carried the blood of a crown. When her ship descended into the hidden valley of her scattered people, she stepped out into the light with the human at her side. At first the crowd stared in silence, unable to believe the figure before them was real. But when she spoke, her voice carried across the gathering with strength that broke through years of despair. She told them her name, she told them her blood, she told them she had endured chains and fire, but she had not surrendered. Her words spread like fire through dry grass, and her people answered with tears and cries of loyalty. They bowed not to a myth but to their princess returned in flesh and spirit. Days became nights filled with preparation as she listened to their stories and shared in their pain. She was not above them, she was among them, scarred and wounded yet unbroken. The human worked beside her, repairing ships, training warriors, teaching them tactics drawn from countless battles he had fought. Together they turned the camp of survivors into a rising force, and as they trained, the shadow of war grew nearer until finally the sky itself was torn open by the arrival of the enemy fleet. The heavens shook with the roar of weapons and fire rained down, but the exiles did not scatter. Guided by her voice, they rose into the fight. Small fighters darted like arrows against the massive warships, and on the ground defenses lit the darkness with their defiance. The human fought with a soldier's calm, his presence a wall no enemy could break, while the princess stood at the command, her staff in hand, not hiding behind her people, but standing at their front. She led charges, she deflected strikes, and she fought with the fury of a heart that had carried grief for too long. Her people answered her with courage, each one willing to die if it meant she could live to reclaim their crown. The battle raged until the enemy realized the strength they faced was no longer a broken remnant. They were facing a kingdom reborn. With each loss, their courage faltered, and at last the fleet turned and fled into the void, unwilling to be crushed by the fire of those they had once enslaved. Silence followed the retreat, and then a cry of victory rose from every throat as her people lifted their banners high. They had survived, they had won, and they had a leader again. In the days that followed, her people crowned her. There was no palace and no golden throne, only the gathered voices of those who had waited for her return. They placed a simple crown of her ancestors upon her head, and when she looked out over them, her voice trembled not with fear but with love. She swore that she would never let them fall again. She promised that no chain would ever bind them while she lived. And beside her stood the human, silent and strong, the one who had seen the truth in her when all others mocked. Without him, she would still be a beast in a cage, but because of him she stood as a princess crowned. The stars watched as history turned and the legend began, a tale that would be told across the galaxy for generations. She was no longer the animal they once jeered at. She was no longer the broken girl behind iron bars. She was the princess of her people, and the fire of her crown burned bright once more. The end.